Hey friends, welcome to another episode of Soulful Producers. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to program some vintage live sounding drums in the style of Anderson Paak. We've got these two grooves going on. This is the first one. And this is the second one. All these drum samples are going to be available for free in the link in the description, so make sure to check that out. So the first groove we got going on is a little more laid back with a very kind of drunk feeling on the hi-hat. Check it out. Before we dive into the actual grooves, let's talk a little about sound selection. So what we got going on is two kick samples, one live and one very digital, and the same for the snare. One live snare and one very digital snare. What I'm looking to achieve here is have the real sample as my main sample, but then with the digital sample just enhance it a little bit, give it a little more depth and a little more punch. This is what my real kick sounds like. This kick sample is from our Paak Soulful Grooves Volume 1, which you can find on our website in the link in the description. I just have a little bit of processing going on. If I take it off, it sounds like this. And with processing, just enhancing the lows a little bit, cleaning up the mids a little bit, and giving it a good amount of distortion with the capitator. Here's without the capitator, and with. This P mode on the capitator gave me that very crunchy kind of tape distortion that you find in Anderson Paak's drums. And I also had to cut the sample because it's a very long sample. Check it out. It's got a lot of room, so if you chop it up, and for this kind of sound, we want it to be very tight. Once the real kick was sounding good, I brought in a digital kick just to enhance it a little bit. So it's got a good amount of punchiness and knock. And when we add that to the real kick sample, it sounds like this. This is just the real one. Here's with the digital one. A little punchier. Same thing for the snare. I have a real snare. Got some processing going on. This is without. I also had to cut it a little bit. It's got the sound of the actual snares under it, so I had to cut it so it sounds nice and dry, nice and tight. I added an EQ, just boosting some low end, cleaning up the mids, giving it a little bit of air, then some decapitator with the same P mode. Get a little of that tape kind of distortion, and then just one more EQ, boosting a little bit of high end, but cutting the very high air just to give it a bit of a vintage sound. And once that snare was sounding good, I added my digital snare sample, which sounds like this. Again, it's very punchy and very digital, and when we add that to the real snare, it sounds like this. This is without the digital one, and with. So altogether, my kicks and snares sound like this. And then for the hi-hats, in the first groove, I used 3 different samples, and they sound like this. So I have 2 closed samples. One of the closed samples is a little louder and just a little bit more open, then a very closed one, and then an open one. And if we press tab here in Ableton and go here and open up the hi-hats, I selected all of them and sent them all to the same choke group. That way, as soon as you play a new sample, the previous one that was sounding no longer sounds. And that way you can get the hi-hats to feel like as soon as it opens, it closes right up, and there's never 2 samples sounding at the same time. And in terms of processing for the hi-hat, I just EQ'd a little bit. Cut some low ends, some low mids, gave it a little bit of mids, and cut some very high air to make it sound a little vintage. Now in the programming is where it gets very interesting. This is what the MIDI looks like for my kicks, and keep in mind I have 2 kicks, so my 2 kicks are doing the exact same thing. Basically, it's all to the grid except that second kick in our second and fourth bar. You see it's a little off the grid to the right, just coming in a little late. It makes it feel like the drummer is dragging a little bit, like he's sort of drunk, you know, that drunk feeling. And that late kick is a really cool thing because it just kind of pulls the music back a little bit It makes it feel a little more relaxed. And if you notice, all my other kicks are right on the grid. It's just that one that's off. If you play with that one alone, it's gonna feel really cool. Because if you start getting them all over the place, it's gonna feel like it loses foundation. But if there's one kick hit that's very intentionally pulled back, it's gonna feel awesome. And then this is the MIDI for my live snare. My two snares are doing pretty similar things. The digital snare is only playing on the backbeats, so on the 2 and 4, but my live snare is doing a little more fills. And I'm just doing the fills with the live snare because it just makes it feel a little more organic. That way it's not always this big punchy snare doing the fills and everything, but it's just a live one doing some bounces on the snare. And if you look carefully, my first snare hit is a little to the left. It's coming a little before. That way it feels like on the snare, my drummer is kind of pushing the beat a little bit, but then on the kick, he's dragging it back. So it's like this back and forth. Then my second snare hit is right on the beat. And if you notice, whenever I have snare fills, I'm bringing the velocity down to make it feel even more organic. And in my last bar of the whole loop, I'm making the snare go even busier. That way it's always very playful, always very dynamic. And then the hi-hats are where it gets very interesting. Check it out. So as I said, I have 3 samples, and if you look closely, only my first hi-hat is right on the beat, and then they're all a little behind. The one that's most behind by a lot is gonna be my third hi-hat. And this is very intentional because right after the snare hits, I want the hi-hat to be a little late to give it like a cool rhythmic contrast between the snare and the hi-hat. So the snare hits and then the hi-hat hits right after. You can see it's like on the grid, but a 16th note behind. Or this would actually be a 32nd note because we're in double time here. And that one right there gives it a whole lot of bounce. So it's always my third hi-hat that's coming way behind. Then the second time again. So the second and fourth hi-hat, I'm just playing around with them, putting them a little behind the beat, but the third one is the one that's most behind the beat. And then with the velocities, I'm also playing a lot. So in this groove, my first hi-hat is always my loudest, and then my third hi-hat is the second loudest. Then the second and the fourth hi-hat are nice and quiet. Check it out. These two are the lowest. The first one is the loudest, and the third one is right in between. And right at the end of the 2-bar phrase, I'm throwing in the open hat. So that's my first groove. Again, it sounds like this. And then this is my second groove. This groove is a little simpler. The kicks are pretty much the same thing as the ones in the first groove, but they're all quantized to the grid. This is because this groove is more like a halftime kind of groove with a faster hi-hat. So if I start putting things all over the place, it's just gonna mess up the groove that the hi-hats have going on. So the kick is nice and firm to the grid. Then my snares, it's the same thing going on. My live snare is doing some fills here and there, and my digital snare is only doing the backbeats. And then for my hi-hats, I just have a hi-hat loop going on. This is like the lazy way of doing it. And in our sample pack, Soulful Grooves Volume 1, you can find a lot of hi-hat loops that work perfectly for this vibe. All I did to this was process it a little bit, and it works perfectly. I just gave it some decapitator. With the P mode, this P mode is awesome for this kind of drum. Then a little EQ, filtering out the lows, giving it a bit of a vintage vibe. And then some kickstart to give it a little bit of swing and bounce. And that's pretty much it for the second groove. It's a lot more simple than the first one, but it works really well with this fast hi-hat. It just keeps everything in place very well.